There was a woman who was 6 months pregnant in the detention facility.
Oh boy. So it looks like the controversy treadmill still spinning out of control. There's this weird debate going on about white supremacy. I'm not going to wade into this too deep, but I want to say this because, one, I have actually, I have written before on the topic of white supremacy. But I would like to maybe make a couple of things clear. This is a difficult subject. Obviously, the topic is, it's very emotional to a lot of people, sometimes even to myself. In the latest spat, I guess it was some podcast with the Mad Mamluks and Imam Yusuf Rios, and it seemed like it really became at some point people kind of shouting past each other and not really talking to each other, and then of course social media doing its thing, and everything kind of getting lost in the sauce. And I think that we have to contend with a couple of things. One, there's no, or there should be rather, no attempt to do away with the historical record that undoubtedly white supremacy is a thing and that there were great atrocities committed in its name. Perhaps it would be better understood as both sort of white supremacy slash Eurocentrism. I don't know, because, I think for some American whites, anyway, I don't know. I'm not even going to go in that direction, right? So one, there's the historical record that is, we can't argue with. And importantly, I've seen some people saying, well, whites aren't the only people to have committed certain kinds of historical atrocities. That's true. What I don't like with that kind of commentary, though, is in many ways is to say, well, their atrocities are the same as done as others. No, there's no doubt, at least certainly within the historical record, that some things that were done by the so-called white Eurocentric Western world were on an epic scale unseen before. And that shouldn't be easily dismissed. For brevity's sake, for this little commentary though, right? Fast forward to the present time. I think what we have today, and this is where sometimes I see frustrated. I have a good friend of mine who is a professor of education, writes a lot about white supremacy from a structural point of view. And I think what we see today is there are some people of color, right? Black, brown, Latino, whatever you want to call it, that while they don't want to turn their blind eye to the historical record of said atrocities, I think that, one, they also don't want to become victims. They're very much afraid of a kind of group victimology, which can in some ways definitely be very dispossessing in the way that their predecessors were perhaps dispossessed of wealth or land. The victimology narrative can certainly dispossess us today of agency. And therefore, a lot of the sort of, decolonial, destructural, postmodern scholarship is sort of seems to be unwilling to or unable to acknowledge that there are people of color today that don't want to be pigeonholed and boxed into what atrocities happened to their predecessors. For right or wrong, right? I think that postmodern decolonial studies are going to have to reckon with that, right? And I think that's what the, Thomas Sowell's of the community, I think I have never met the man, I've read his works, I get that's part of where he's coming from, right? Now, the other part that I also draw issue with is that people want to kind of be in a hurry and say, well, that was what happened in the past and there's nothing going on today. Why should I be responsible for something that happened 400 years ago? I didn't have any role in it. Well, there is definitely a modicum of truth in that. But there should also be an acknowledgement that kind of what goes along with the notion of white privilege, a subset of white supremacy, is undoubtedly whites will have certain advantages socially. And this is on a broad level. It doesn't mean that every single white person will be socially advantaged, but undoubtedly there will be more social advantages available to them. There will be certain things that they will be either assumed of or pardoned of or immune to that non-whites just won't, like being pulled over while you're black, right? Driving while black is a thing that cannot be contested. So we have to, this thing is really nuanced. And if we box ourselves into either white supremacy is basically like Yom al-Qiyamah, it's al-Waqi'ah, right? It's like the calamity, either zuzilat al-ardu zilzalaha. It's like the end of time scenario of which we cannot escape. That's problematic from even a theological level. At the same time, the Quran speaks enormously in volumes on dhulm, on oppression, and undoubtedly there is, or there has been, and even continues to be, an unjust system that runs on the assumptions and proclivities of Eurocentric / white supremacy. Note to self when you're going to do a video, make sure everything is charged. So one area, though, that I do see where white supremacy as the value system, not just simply as only the oppressive system, right? Because oppression is only one aspect of white supremacy, or what I kind of call white supremacy Eurocentrism, right? The other aspect is it as a value set that not only privileges white values above non-white values, because that actually, in some ways, that can happen in many different societies in which there are different groups, echelons, ethnicities, you name it, right? But what it does is it tends to actually take those values, those likes, those dislikes, those constructions of beautiful and ugly and so on and so forth, is it kind of raises them to the level of transcendent, right? That it makes them kind of like as if it were God speaking, and that's the biggest problem. That's the biggest problem. So where I still see that being an issue is, what is it, baby? I'm trying to do something.
I just wanted to charge it.
Note to self, tell your daughter that you're trying to record a video. So the area that I see actually where this is the biggest issue is in the area of values, particularly as it relates to the Muslim community. Whiteness is still esteemed to be kind of like the carrier of not only civilization, but the apex of civilization, meaning that like there was a brother who asked why is it that if white supremacy is so bad, why do so many Muslims, why do they move from Muslim countries to the West? And that, sure, they might be trying to escape certain issues that could be due to what he said, dictators and whatnot, although who tends to prop up the dictators? The other aspect is, just to be honest, and Ibn Khaldun writes about this, as many other sociologists, is how the conquered will come to identify with the conquered. Even though they may, in one way, loathe them and despise them, they still, in many ways, come to identify with them and see them to be superior. We actually just saw this in a recent round where you had these like Hindu nationalists that were essentially bootlicking and brown-nosing white supremacists online, and even when they were rebuffed by the white supremacists, they kind of acknowledged that, okay, yes, they have the right to be in that pecking order. And I mean, it was just something completely like, am I really watching this, right? So I do believe, right, like when it comes to the whole like ex-Muslim thing, right, Muslims leaving Islam, a lot of it has to do with because Islam has not successfully competed in the marketplace of ideas with white norms, and therefore whatever conclusions whites come to, then those are the conclusions we're going to come. So if God doesn't exist, then we're going to leave. Or if God is now white Jesus instead of Allah, we'll do that. Because we see some Muslims leaving Islam for Christianity. We see some Muslims leaving Islam and becoming atheist. And yet there are definitely, black atheists out there, writers and whatnot. And yet I don't tend to see to be those are the writers that really are influencing. Similarly, within the Muslim community's kind of newfound fascination with conservatism, particularly amongst non-white, non-black Muslims, so-called immigrant Muslims, right? This newfound fascination with conservatism largely seems rooted in the white Eurocentric articulations of conservatism, and indeed not the Thomas Sowells and so on and so forth. So we can't just chuck it in the waste bin yet, but we should really be cautious about lumping everybody into groups. And I think also the last part is, dhulm has to be, fought against, has to be struggled against, oppression and whatnot. But we always have to remember that Allah can arrange, and often does arrange, the pieces on the historical chessboard that despite our best efforts, despite our worship and our dua and our supplications, Allah may arrange the pieces in such a way that life will be made difficult for us, and we've seen this happen throughout different historical epochs. And it reminds me of the hadith again that the Prophet ﷺ said, يَأْتِي عَلَى النَّاسِ زَمَانٍ, right? There will come a time upon people, الصَّابِرُ فِيهِمْ عَلَى دِينِهِ, right? Of which the perseverant, the one who struggles and is patient and strident, in terms of their religion, كَقَابِض, right? They'll be like a person who is grasping onto jamr, onto a hot burning coal. And there's something in that idea that you may come upon a time in which you will have to be perseverant. And this is something that I see absent in the sort of decolonial, postmodern, deconstructionist philosophies, is that there really isn't any room for God putting you in a situation in which, despite your best efforts to fight against it, you will somehow still have to withstand that and still be virtuous. That you can't just simply become the end justifies the means kind of thing. And that's why, there really isn't a lot of difference between the ideology of extremists, whether they be ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or the other extremists of modern day hardcore atheists and other secularists. Their methodologies may differ sometimes, but they kind of have a similar ideology. There's no room for a sabir. There's no room for the person who struggles, and then certainly in the African American experience, for a good segment of our history in this part of the world, our ancestors had no agency in terms of changing their condition, and yet we got things out of that like religion, spirituality, hymns, and then out of that came the blues and so on and so on. That speaks volumes and testimony to as-sabiru fihim ala dinihi kal-qabid ala al-jamr, like that person is holding on to your faith in the face of oppression will be like holding on to a hot coal. So I hope that the conversation would be a bit more nuanced. I'm kind of curious why even the Mad Mamluks wanted to do this. I've been on their show before, and I was blunt in that I told them that I didn't think that they had a very good grasp of white supremacy or all of the philosophies and scholarship that rotate around it, and that there was a lot of reductionism going on. But anyway, just understand that at least I really feel that this is a much more complicated conversation that needs to be had by cooler heads, that has some kind of endgame scenario in it, and that for us as Muslims has to involve La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah and accountability of our actions. Walillahi alhamd, all praise belongs to Allah. Inshallah, we'll see you around the Muslim social media universe. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum.